The blessing of being involved in More Justice is just one of the great gifts in my life. It began after the horrific tragedy at Mother Emanuel. We reached out to some of the traditional African American congregations in our Northeast Columbia community, and through Reverend Adam China at Adams Northeast AME and Reverend Dr. Ivory Thigpen at Rehoboth Baptist, we sort of formed a coalition in Northeast Columbia to try to break through those racial barriers. But as a process of that, Reverend China said, let's go down to Charleston and for this event called a Nehemiah Action, because there's actually been a justice organization called CAJM in Charleston, as the first in South Carolina. So we went and attended, we rounded up some folks, loaded up some church buses, and went to the Nehemiah Action Assembly in Charleston. And as I kind of stood in the parking lot and just took it in, and then what happened afterward, it was this thought that this is really what the kingdom of God looks like.
MORE is an acronym which stands for Midlands Organized Response for Equity, that's the MORE, and Justice, More Justice. I, for one, as a pastor, have always thought that doing mercy acts, clothing the clothesless and feeding the hungry, was actually doing justice, and volunteering at schools, reading programs and such. But those were acts of mercy, and it wasn't until someone came along and brought up the mandate of what Micah 6 and 8 is a mandate for us Christians, us believers, faith, people of faith, to love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with your God. And then it was explained to me that those mercy acts, which I named, and then walking humbly with our God would be like out my attendance to church. I sing on the choir, I give my offering and tithes, and I do those religious duties, so to speak, and that's walking humbly. But what is justice? Justice work cannot be done alone. It comes in numbers. You need to do it in a community. And I thought, whereas I was doing mercy acts, I was doing justice, but I wasn't.
Yeah, I think another beauty of this sort of unified voice of God's people, particularly in the world we live in today, where there's so much division along political lines and other ways, is that the process itself leads us to be guided by God's voice. So every year we don't start with an agenda. Every year we start with house gatherings.
My wife and I, Helen and I, are team leaders at Living Springs, and that's our involvement with More Justice. We've been involved from the very beginning. Pastor Eric got Living Springs involved from the very outset, and we've been a part of that ministry. The team leaders are the people who bring other members of the congregation on board, host the house meetings, which are the foundation of this ministry.
We have what's called house meetings among congregations, where you gather people from your community and you sit around and talk about what keeps you up at night. What's something that's most disturbing that you maybe have no control over, and you can't fix it by yourself, but yet it grates on your mind and your heart.
And then all those stories are shared. We come together each fall in the Community Problems Assembly. Then we pray over for God's vision there and say, God, what would you have us address to make a difference here in our local community?
And those one or two issues become the issues for the year, and that in turn becomes the focal point of each year's More Justice activity that culminates in the Nehemiah Action. The Nehemiah Action is modeled after the figure Nehemiah from the Scriptures. After the exile, Nehemiah was in charge of helping reestablish Jerusalem, and what had happened is economically there are some people who had taken advantage of others, and there were many, many people who were being abused by an unjust system. Nehemiah gathered the people together and confronted the people in power and challenged them to do justice, and they did. But it worked because Nehemiah had a mass of people behind him advocating, representing what he was advocating. And so we model our ministry after Nehemiah. We try to gather people around one issue and confront civic leaders, community leaders, with that topic, that issue, and don't just say we've got a problem, but we offer a solution, a researched solution. And they in turn are invited to the stage in front of all those people who are their constituents to either say yes or no publicly.
I would say what drew me into the work of doing this justice work is when I found out that there was something called crisis intervention training. It turns out that there was a high population of mental health diagnosis in prison systems. Well, that costs, the more people you have in prison, that costs the city money. And so we looked into that, and we have research teams. There are several people that dedicate themselves to doing the research of a problem that we are approaching each year. And so this particular year was about mental health and that mental health diagnosis. And so the research discovered that the police, when they're called out, a person may be having a mental health crisis, and because the police isn't aware of what it is, they arrest a person. They think they're being combative, and then that person goes to jail, but they were having a mental health crisis. So what we did, what More Justice did, we found out that the City of Columbia Police Department had maybe only 8 of their officers trained in this crisis intervention training. CIT. And so More Justice says, well, let's see about getting all of the officers of the police department and the sheriff's department trained in this particular area so that we'll have less arrests of mental health. And sure enough, we have grown. We introduced it to the chief of police and the sheriff's department, and they agreed to do it. And we went from having 8 officers trained to over 150 trained in this 7-year period. And at one of our big organized gatherings called the Nehemiah Action, that's another story, is that a policeman sent a letter to our organization saying, thank you that I have been trained for this crisis intervention training. I was called out on a case that had I not been trained, my life would have been just as much in jeopardy as the victim that I was called out to render service to.
Well, another beautiful thing that's happened in South Carolina is I mentioned More Justice in the Midlands started because a group of us went to see how justice was organized in Charleston with CAJM, and then since our 7 years here in the Midlands, now a beautiful thing is that GOAL is the name of the justice organization that is formed in Greenville.
I was first introduced to the concept of GOAL about 2 years ago. Pastor Cole mentioned to me that there was an organization called DART that was trying to make a presence in Greenville. I was intrigued, even more so when I discovered that the mission of DART is to encourage congregations in doing justice. I attended initial meetings and was inspired by groups from Columbia and Charleston. They weren't just talking about change, they were implementing powerful systemic change. We took that idea and brought it home to Greenville.
GOAL, Greenville Organized for Accountable Leadership, was created at the perfect time in the life of Trinity Greenville. Our Trinity family, like many of our congregations across the Synod, excels at mercy ministry, feeding the hungry, extending radical hospitality, creating safe spaces for all people. People of color, the LGBTQIA+ community, those struggling with poverty and or mental health challenges. Mercy ministry, we are all about it. Justice ministry, however, is a very different thing. Justice ministry, to which we are called in baptism, is not just about feeding and housing and supporting and loving people. Justice ministry is about making systemic changes to create a safe, equitable, and just Greenville for all people, no exceptions.
I was a founding board member and team leader for GOAL. And what has that meant to me? It's meant the world. I'm an advocate of the logic, even if it only affects one person, it is worth the effort. We all can make a difference daily by even our smallest of efforts, along with love and support. But together, how much more can we do?
Creating a safe, just, and equitable community means challenging elected leaders to make decisions that benefit the least of these. Since the inception of GOAL, 29 faith communities have been working to create affordable housing, that's housing for households making less than $35,000 annually, and more services to support positive mental health. There's no way we at Trinity could do this by ourselves. It takes people power, lots of people, many justice seekers showing up together at our annual Nehemiah Action event to speak truth to power, to demand that our elected officials establish funding to create truly affordable housing in Greenville and to fully fund the 988 crisis line.
God is keeping God's promise to help and guide us in bringing God's kingdom on earth. I feel certain that Christ weeps at the sight of so many people being pushed out of Greenville due to the lack of truly affordable housing. I feel certain that Christ weeps at the way lawmakers and community leaders continue to ignore the mental health crisis which plagues people of all ages. But God is celebrating to see God's people come together to enact change. God is celebrating when we set our eyes on God's dream instead of on our own. God is celebrating when God's people finally demand justice and equity for all people.
As a Christian, our faith guides us to serve others. But I'm not sure that in my serving, justice was a word that always came to mind. Something that comes naturally to Christians' minds when they think of serving is more along the lines of giving to others. With Goal, it became more about fighting the good fight.
Our City Council has designated resources of about $10 million annually to fund affordable housing. Our lawmakers in Columbia have fully funded the 988 crisis line for this fiscal year. Are these one-time funds, or will these funds be renewed? We do not know, which is why we have to keep the pressure on so that our demands for justice will be met. Justice ministry is about stewardship, using our gifts and graces together with many of God's people to do great things for the world.
To think about this paradigm of Micah and Jesus' call to do justice, love kindness, and walk faithfully with God, and how probably most of my life had been in faithfulness ministries, worship, Bible study, all the things we do, or mercy ministries, helping people with immediate needs. But there was this deep yearning that I really didn't know what it looked like to be a good steward of my time and energy and finances when it came to doing justice. There was this calling and sense to do it, but how do you actually do it? And I think that's the case for many of the people in our congregations.